While searching in the Flintshire archives last week, I found a photograph of an elderly couple called Mr. and Mrs. Emlyn Jones of Coed Talon, which is a village between Wrexham and Mold. There was a note attached to the photograph which told the story that when Emlyn Jones was a boy, and this was before World War I, he used to light fires on a Sabbath for the Lewis family, who were Jews from Poland who settled near his home in Coed Talon. It's clear that the Lewis family had changed their Polish name to Lewis to help them assimilate into the British Isles. I'll send the photograph on WhatsApp as soon as this message is posted, and Becky will email it to you when she emails the podcast later. So you'll have a copy of the photograph and the note attached to it. 2 years ago, I had a visit from a childhood friend, David Brown, who spotted a menorah in my hallway. He asked if I was Jewish, and he began to tell me that he was. He grew up with David, and my parents were close friends with his parents, but we never knew they were Jews. They lived in the next village, and Mr. Brown was a probation officer, and they were a very nice family, and my parents knew them well and always had a great deal of respect for them. I've no idea how my parents struck up a close bond with them, but Mr. Brown even gave his Labrador dog to my parents, and that was a golden Labrador, similar to Olive, Rick and Wendy's beautiful dog. Mr. Brown's family had obviously changed their name to help assimilate, and of course they did very well because nobody knew they were Jews. Well, we didn't as children anyway. Then we have our wonderful support elder, Les Harris. His family background is that they are Eastern European Jews who came to the British Isles and again changed their name to Harris. Les is one of the most wonderful men I know, and his and Margaret's ministry proves the most welcoming. These families, like the Lewis family from Coed Talon, probably arrived before World War I, when there were pogroms in Europe, and were probably their arrival was the result of persecution. Clearly, these families were soon loved and respected in their communities, and using their names, Lewis, Brown and Harris, they've assimilated very well. Not that God would want Jews to assimilate. He wants them to go and live in the land of Israel today. And that reminds me to ask you to pray for Gail and Jackie, who are flying to Warsaw this weekend, to tell Jews of Warsaw that they must fulfill the prophecies regarding returning to the land that God promised their ancestors as an everlasting possession. And it is time for them to go back now. And Jackie and Gail are going to tell them that in Eastern Europe. So please pray for them while they're away. They come back on the 19th of this month. After World War II, our government didn't allow us to welcome Jews in the way that which I know we as ordinary people would have done. And a Gallup poll, which took place in 1943, proved that we would have done so. But the government intervened in the immigration of Jews after World War II. Within a month of World War II, the British government agreed to allow entry to up to 1,000 orphan Jewish children under the age of 16 who had survived the death camps in Europe. They were to enter under temporary visas and stay in hostels, and were given landing visas for Australia and Palestine, as Israel was then known. 300 of these children were sourced from Theresienstadt camp, where they had seen much death and suffered greatly. By the end of October 1945, 450 children were accepted into the British Isles from other camps in Germany. And by the end of the armistice, 600 mainly Polish children, Jewish children under 16 who were found wandering throughout Europe, were admitted under a temporary visa agreement. Children who were suffering from TB, however, were separated from those who were being sent to the UK, and they remained in Europe awaiting possible entry to the then Palestine. What is interesting for me is that there was a restriction on the numbers of Jewish children allowed entry into the British Isles, despite the obvious desire of ordinary British people to help and support them. Yet we allowed 100,000 non-Jewish Polish families in, and 9,000 of those were SS officers. And we know that from medical records, which show that they had the SS tattoo under their arms, which gave the details of their blood group in case they were injured during the war. So we knew they were Nazi officers, SS officers, and yet we allowed them in. And yet we only allowed actually under 3,000 Jews altogether, and about 1,000 children in after the war. And it's interesting that we were wanting adults to come in who were non-Jewish, who would work in the factories, in the coal mines, under the European Voluntary Workers regulations, and they came in with permanent visas, where Jews only were allowed in with temporary visas. So there was discrimination by the British government, but not, I want to add this, by the British people, ordinary people. Yeshua says that he recognizes those who welcomed and cared for the Jewish people. I'm going to read Matthew 25:34-40. It says, "Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, and I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family,'" and he means the Jewish people, "you did it to me." After the war, many ordinary people like Emlyn Jones just lacked the opportunity to do so because of the policies of the British government. Now, last night, more rockets hit Sderot and the community surrounding Gaza, fired by terrorists in Gaza. And there are continuing threats of war against Israel. I know that we here at Father's House would accept families from Israel for refuge should there be an all-out war. But I wonder if the government would allow them entry. Please pray. Ask God to open up doors for us to be a blessing to the Jewish people. Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.